Israel's a long way away from from defeating Hamas, and I don't think Israel has the capability of defeating Hamas. There was a battle fought in northern Gaza just yesterday, and when you read about it, it said that Israeli forces advanced into this neighborhood, but were compelled to retreat back to their starting position because of the heavy Hamas resistance. Wait a minute, I thought you told me that Hamas has been eradicated in northern Gaza. And yet you can't go into a piece of ground and occupy it because Hamas is resisting to a degree that compelled you to retreat. So this isn't just one or two guys popping up with, rocket-propelled grenades. This is organized resistance. And Hamas will come back and will reoccupy that territory. Gaza can't be occupied by Israel.
In a significant observation, it's essential to note that Hamas is just one of several resistance organizations operating in Gaza. While Hamas serves as the governing body, with the Qassam brigades as a major military force, Palestinian Islamic Jihad also plays a substantial role, alongside numerous other factions boasting hundreds to thousands of fighters. Consequently, many casualties that Israel attributes to Hamas may not actually involve its members, but rather innocent civilians or individuals affiliated with other groups. Interestingly, even the most optimistic assessments indicate that about 85% of Hamas's resistance remains intact after 6 months of conflict, showcasing the resilience of these forces despite ongoing hostilities. Recent developments highlight the ongoing complexities of the situation in Gaza, particularly following a meeting between Hamas and Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah. Reports indicate that Nasrallah inquired whether it was time to escalate actions, but the Qassam brigades reassured him that they had the situation under control. This perspective contrasts with claims of substantial Hamas losses. While some reports suggest they've only lost 10% of their operational capacity, the truth likely lies somewhere in between. Notably, Israeli Defense Forces acknowledge that Hamas has not been defeated, as reflected in their own media. For instance, a recent battle in northern Gaza demonstrated that Israeli forces advanced but had to retreat due to strong Hamas resistance. This suggests that the presence of Hamas is not merely a few sporadic fighters, but rather an organized resistance with effective command and logistics. Furthermore, Israel has not succeeded in occupying Shifa Hospital, having retreated after their initial actions, which some have termed atrocities. This reality indicates that Israel faces significant challenges in achieving its goals against Hamas, raising questions about its overall capability to secure a definitive victory in the ongoing conflict. They claim this operation is the most effective military campaign in warfare history, achieving its immediate results. However, now that they've withdrawn, it's likely Hamas will reclaim the territory. Gaza cannot be effectively occupied by Israel. 6 months in, they've only diminished 15% of Hamas's presence. If they continue for another 6 months, they might reach 30%. And after a year, perhaps 60%. But that still leaves 40% intact. This situation isn't sustainable for another 6 months, let alone a year. As for the current international climate, many are skeptical about expanding the conflict, criticizing the idea of urging Iran to retaliate. Some express frustration with what they perceive as misguided advice regarding the situation. It's essential to recognize that Israel is not winning against Hamas. The aim of Hamas's October 7th actions was not to ignite a wider regional conflict, but to foster the conditions for a Palestinian state, and this objective is materializing. Hamas is achieving its goals, while Israel is increasingly compelled to consider ceasefires and hostage exchanges, as the current strategy isn't viable for continuing conflict. The focus shouldn't be on escalating tensions with Iran. It's crucial to understand the strategic reality. It's about long-term objectives, and for Hamas, that means establishing a Palestinian state, a topic that is gaining traction in discussions now more than it has in the past. Prior to October 6th, the plight of the Palestinian people was largely ignored on the global stage. No significant players were discussing this issue, and countries like Saudi Arabia were pursuing their interests without regard for Palestine. The normalization of relations with Israel and support for the Abraham Accords undermined any serious talk about a Palestinian state. Supporting such initiatives while advocating for a Palestinian state is contradictory, as they facilitate continued settlement expansion and partitioning of the West Bank. In this context, the notion of supporting Palestine rings hollow, when contrasted with the reality of these agreements. If you're aligned with Israel, you might argue that the Likud party incorporates this vision into their mission. Israel has long pursued the idea of a greater Israel, sidelining the concept of Palestine. However, this ongoing conflict has now brought the issue of Palestine back into focus. To effectively undermine this movement, a shift in the narrative towards global energy security could be crucial. Consider this: if oil prices soared to $120 or $150 a barrel and gas hit $10 a gallon, do you think the American public would still prioritize discussions about Palestinian freedom? It's unlikely. They would turn their attention to the economic implications of high fuel prices, as the prevailing sentiment would be, it's the economy, stupid. Thus, it would be counterproductive to shift American focus back to the Palestinian cause when the strategic goal of creating a Palestinian state is gaining traction like never before. To effectively hinder this development, the conversation should encompass broader geopolitical issues, including Iranian, Saudi, and UAE oil production, and the potential disruption of global oil supplies. In such a climate of rising energy costs and economic downturn, concern for Palestine would likely diminish significantly. So, while some may criticize this perspective as misguided, it's rooted in a strategic understanding of how to prioritize objectives. The focus should remain on the strategic goal, the establishment of a Palestinian state. You're highlighting an important dynamic in the current geopolitical landscape, particularly regarding Iran and its evolving relationships. Iran is indeed navigating a complex situation, especially with the normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia facilitated by China. This marks a significant shift in the Middle Eastern geopolitical fabric, potentially leading to a more multipolar world in contrast to U.S. hegemony. The expansion of BRICS, with Iran and Saudi Arabia as members, reflects this trend toward multipolarity. However, as you pointed out, BRICS lacks formal institutions at this stage. The upcoming meeting in Kazan, chaired by Russia, is crucial as it aims to establish economic and political frameworks that could strengthen ties among member nations. While there may not be a formal military alliance, increased political engagement often leads to enhanced military cooperation as countries recognize the need to protect shared interests. Iran and Russia are indeed trying to bolster their relationship, moving beyond historical tensions. Their mutual interests in resisting Western sanctions and expanding their economic ties illustrate a growing partnership. However, both nations must navigate their interests carefully. Iran, for instance, must avoid straining its relationship with Russia, especially as Russia continues to deal with the aftermath of sanctions and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Russia's path has not been straightforward. It faced significant economic uncertainty following the sanctions, and Putin's initial hesitance regarding mobilization reflects this. The eventual stabilization and modest growth of the Russian economy suggest a cautious recovery, but as you mentioned, the situation remains delicate. The focus on building economic ties with countries like China and India is critical for Russia as it seeks to diversify its partnerships and reduce reliance on Western markets. However, as these relationships develop, they still need time to mature into a robust strategic alliance. The geopolitical landscape is indeed shifting, and how Iran, Russia, and other nations navigate these changes will be pivotal in determining the future balance of power. In this context, it's also essential to consider how the U.S. and its allies will respond. The American approach to the Middle East and its commitment to Israel could face significant challenges if regional dynamics continue to evolve toward multipolarity. This evolving situation may require a reevaluation of strategies and a shift toward engagement rather than confrontation. You're right to emphasize the delicate balance Russia must maintain regarding its relationships and strategic priorities, particularly with Iran. The current geopolitical landscape is still in a formative stage, and many of these relationships have not yet developed the stability needed to withstand significant crises. If Iran were to escalate tensions or take provocative actions that lead to a broader conflict, it could indeed complicate Russia's position. As you noted, Russia is still deeply engaged in resolving the situation in Ukraine, and any distraction or diversion of resources could undermine its efforts there. The Russian leadership would likely weigh the risks of deepening its involvement with Iran against the potential consequences for its own economy and geopolitical goals. Russia's emphasis on diplomacy is a key asset in navigating these complex dynamics. By promoting dialogue and caution, Russia can seek to stabilize the situation without overcommitting to any single ally or conflict. This approach allows them to focus on their primary objectives while managing relationships with other powers, including Iran. In this context, it's plausible that Russia would encourage Iran to exercise restraint, emphasizing the importance of strategic patience. The notion of waiting for the right moment to retaliate, one that doesn't escalate into broader conflict, could align with Russia's long-term goals. Additionally, the interplay between Russian and Iranian interests is a crucial factor. While they share some common goals, their relationship is also shaped by historical complexities and differing strategic priorities. Thus, any aggressive moves by Iran could strain their partnership, prompting Russia to advocate for a more measured approach. As these dynamics unfold, Russia's ability to maintain its focus on Ukraine while managing its relationships in the Middle East will be vital. The ongoing discussions about diplomacy and restraint will likely play a significant role in shaping the next phase of this geopolitical landscape. Ultimately, the balance of power is still in flux, and how these countries navigate their alliances and conflicts will have lasting implications for regional and global stability. To start off, Israel and Hezbollah have been engaged in a long-standing conflict. Hezbollah was formed in response to Israel's invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon in 1982. Initially, the Shia community in southern Lebanon maintained a neutral stance, viewing the conflict primarily as one between Israel and the PLO. However, as the situation escalated into an occupation, they united into a resistance movement, which ultimately became known as Hezbollah. This group proved highly effective in combating Israeli forces, successfully driving them out of southern Lebanon in 2000. It's important to note that Hezbollah has consistently been successful against Israel. Their next significant victory came in 2006 during Israel's military campaign against Hezbollah. Throughout that conflict, Hezbollah managed to launch rockets into northern Israel, and despite Israel's efforts, they were unable to dislodge Hezbollah from their positions in southern Lebanon or push them back to the Litani River. Israel heavily bombarded Beirut and southern Lebanon, yet ultimately failed to dismantle the resistance, leading to a significant loss in the conflict. Hezbollah did not defeat Israel in the traditional sense. Rather, Israel was unable to fulfill its promise of destroying Hezbollah, resulting in Hezbollah emerging victorious and tarnishing Israel's reputation. Since that time, Israel and Hezbollah have maintained a tense relationship, with Hezbollah preparing for a major confrontation that will differ from previous conflicts, focusing on taking the fight directly to Israel. Meanwhile, Israel has also been preparing, but their approach to warfare often mirrors Hezbollah's tactics. Engaging Hezbollah will require intense combat, with infantry needing to close in and eliminate the enemy using firepower and maneuver. This close-quarters combat is expected to be bloody and chaotic, resulting in significant casualties for Israel. Politically, Israel is not equipped to handle losses of this magnitude, as it has historically struggled to absorb such impacts. Consequently, Israel has developed a military strategy that reflects these challenges. Israel places a significant emphasis on technology, from their advanced Merkava tanks to their armored fighting vehicles, air force, and intelligence capabilities. Their military strategy relies on technological superiority to impose their will on adversaries. However, Hezbollah has been making strides to match Israel's technological capabilities. While they may not possess advanced fighter jets like the F-35 or F-16, Hezbollah boasts a substantial arsenal of precision-guided long-range missiles that can target Israel extensively. Additionally, they have sophisticated air defense systems and anti-shipping missiles, along with the ability to deploy drones for reconnaissance over sensitive Israeli sites, turning these into actionable targets for their missiles. Hezbollah is preparing to mobilize tens of thousands of troops to engage in combat within northern Israel, shifting the battlefield from southern Lebanon to Israeli towns and villages. Their aim is to capture northern Israel, taking Galilee and isolating the Golan Heights. In 2022 and 2023, Israel conducted two major training exercises, one called Operation Chariots of Fire, aimed at testing the readiness of their defense forces against simultaneous threats from Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, and allied militias. They concluded that, should they face a coordinated attack, they would require substantial American support, which the U.S. is hesitant to provide. Importantly, during these exercises, Israel did not anticipate an attack from Hamas in Gaza, thinking instead that unrest would occur in the West Bank and Gaza, manageable through standard policing methods. However, following the events of October 7th, Gaza became the primary front, leading to the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of reservists, and a significant commitment of resources to the conflict. As a result, Israel has found itself in a prolonged war with Hamas, which was not part of their initial military calculations. Now, Israel faces the prospect of engaging Hezbollah while its military is already stretched thin and fatigued from the ongoing conflict in Gaza. Their forces are worn out, morale is low, and they are struggling with logistics, including broken tanks and dwindling ammunition supplies. This situation presents a stark contrast to the conditions during their earlier exercises, where they faced a fresh army, highlighting the precarious position Israel finds itself in as it contemplates further military action in Lebanon. Israel is currently in a difficult position, crushed, demoralized, and unprepared for a conflict with Hezbollah. They lack sufficient troops, ammunition, and properly maintained equipment. The Israeli Defense Forces are aware of these shortcomings, which is why they have advised Prime Minister Netanyahu against escalating the situation further. It's crucial to acknowledge that Israel's existential survival is at stake. A major ground war against Hezbollah, especially with Iranian involvement, could lead to devastating consequences for the nation. While Israel has the capability to inflict destruction on southern Lebanon and Beirut, this impending conflict is poised to be a war of attrition, unlike anything seen in the region before, marked by a level of violence that is orders of magnitude greater than previous encounters. The intensity of this battle will be severe, with both sides engaged in a fierce exchange of fire. Hezbollah aims to target Israeli airfields to prevent their aircraft from striking Hezbollah positions, creating a situation where one side will ultimately achieve fire superiority over the other. In this context, I believe Hezbollah has the upper hand when it comes to firepower. Israel's vulnerability lies in its airfields. If these are taken out, Israel will struggle to respond effectively. There has even been speculation about Israel considering a shift to separate airfields for operations, but those too would be vulnerable. Discussions have also arisen regarding Israel potentially using tactical nuclear weapons to quickly degrade Hezbollah's capabilities, indicating the seriousness of the situation. However, it seems unlikely that Netanyahu would take such drastic measures. His upcoming trip to Washington, D.C. is pivotal, as he must maintain the political narrative of being a wartime leader following the recent conflict with Hamas. This is about his political survival and convincing the Israeli populace of his leadership amidst the backdrop of military challenges. Recently, there's been significant tension within Israeli leadership regarding the ongoing conflict with Hamas. Just weeks ago, a spokesperson stated that Hamas represents an ideology that can't be defeated, which raised eyebrows. The Israeli Defense Forces seem to align with this sentiment, suggesting they are losing the battle against Hamas, a stark acknowledgement of their challenges. In this context, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been looking towards Hezbollah as a potential distraction to maintain his relevance as a wartime leader. However, he is facing pushback not only from military leaders but also from allies, advising against further escalation. This raises the question of how he can sustain his political life. Netanyahu's upcoming trip to Washington, D.C. is crucial. He's set to address Congress, with Speaker Mike Johnson aiming to ensure he receives even more standing ovations than previous leaders. This moment is intended to allow Netanyahu to return to Israel, proclaiming himself as the chosen leader backed by American support during these challenging times. There seems to be a dependency on American approval, with the hope that past controversies will be overlooked in light of this endorsement. Ultimately, this situation highlights that Netanyahu's focus is less about the humanitarian crisis and more about his political survival amid growing dissent and challenges in governance. The situation regarding the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict has indeed led to profound fatigue and desensitization among many observers. The sheer scale of casualties, often represented as numbers, can render individual tragedies into statistics, diminishing the emotional impact. The ongoing violence, including the bombings and the devastation, evokes a deep sense of loss and sorrow, yet many people struggle to process the continuous stream of images and stories that are similar in their horror. This cyclical exposure can lead to a numbing effect, where the public becomes increasingly indifferent to suffering, making it difficult to engage with each new tragedy meaningfully. The loss of individual stories like that of the 6-year-old girl you mentioned highlights the human cost of conflict, but when these stories become frequent, they often lose their power to shock. The challenge remains in finding ways to convey the depth of human experience amidst the relentless nature of violence and tragedy to ensure that the lives lost are remembered as more than just numbers. You're expressing a deep frustration about how the immense human cost of conflict, particularly in Gaza, is often reduced to mere statistics, stripping individuals of their humanity and the value of their lives. This ongoing violence should evoke a visceral reaction, a call to action among citizens and leaders alike. The sheer number of casualties should serve as a rallying point for widespread outrage and a demand for accountability and change. Your sentiment resonates with those who feel that more should be done to address these issues actively. It's disheartening when protests and public demonstrations seem to fade, especially as the situation continues to deteriorate. The challenge is not just raising awareness, but sustaining that awareness in a society often overwhelmed by news cycles and competing narratives. The reaction to dissenting voices, especially those that challenge the dominant narrative surrounding the conflict, reflects a broader issue of polarization. The harsh responses you mentioned indicate how sensitive and complex these discussions can be, often stifling genuine dialogue about the humanitarian crisis and the historical context of the conflict. In this moment, it's crucial to keep the focus on the individual stories, pushing back against the reduction of human lives to statistics and advocating for those who cannot speak for themselves. The call for sustained action and activism is vital, whether through protests, awareness campaigns, or public discussions aiming to influence policymakers and create a more compassionate and just response to the ongoing crisis. It's time to address some uncomfortable truths. What we're hearing from Israel is nothing but deception. The reality is that the Netanyahu administration has failed to provide honest accounts of the situation. While some individuals within the system may speak out, the official narrative remains misleading. Similarly, the American establishment is not being truthful about what's happening either. It's hard to digest the repeated claims of seeing heart-wrenching events, the tragedies, the victims, but many are fabrications. We are well aware of the inconsistencies. Take, for example, the tragic incidents at the outdoor music festival. There's new information suggesting that Hamas is not responsible for the deaths. Rather, it appears the Israeli forces acted under their own directives. Furthermore, reports indicate that Israeli intelligence had prior knowledge of the impending attack. So one must question the decision-making behind allowing such an event to take place so close to Gaza. It raises serious concerns about the competency of Israeli leadership. Let's be clear, while there were atrocities committed, the narratives of horrific acts like the beheading of infants or rape, are not substantiated. The reality is that many lost their lives at the hands of the Israeli Defense Forces. And as for the hostages, the portrayal of their release has been manipulated for public relations. This is a critical moment, and we need to focus on the truth. As we approached Gaza, I witnessed helicopters opening fire, killing my people. While negotiating with Israeli forces at a kibbutz, some tanks fired indiscriminately, claiming the lives of everyone there except me, the sole survivor. Yet amid these horrors, the narrative from some was that Hamas was the sole perpetrator of violence, murdering innocents and committing atrocities. Yes, I've seen the disturbing videos from October 7th. Bad things happened during Hamas's military operation. They attacked with force and took control of critical areas, setting up roadblocks and firing on approaching cars, leading to civilian casualties. In wartime, as history shows, civilians often bear the brunt of the violence. Look at past conflicts, such as our operations in Germany during World War II. We often entered towns without regard for the lives caught in the crossfire. This is the grim reality of war. When Hamas launched its audacious attack, they too became part of that tragic cycle. However, the scale of devastation inflicted by the IDF on their own people dwarfs what Hamas inflicted on Israel. The IDF has killed many of those they were meant to protect, prioritizing their own strategic interests over civilian lives to prevent captures by Hamas. The truth is, it was the IDF that slaughtered those partygoers at the festival and many others in the kibbutz, acting decisively and ruthlessly.